lot of changes, a lot of updates. I think most significantly, the reason that I was able to release today was that I have got through the initial pass of all the timings on the processes. And just to give a refresher on what that means, every process when you go to, you build a building, you build like a refinery or you build a bioreactor or a factory or a shipyard, those are the production chain buildings. You build those, and then when you want to use them, you go to that building and you pick, a number of basically standard recipes, like what process you want to do, first of all. Like, you go to the refinery and like, I want to, electrolyze water into hydrogen and oxygen, for example. Then you pick a source inventory where the inputs are coming from, so the hydrogen, or where the water in this case would be coming from. And then you pick a destination inventory, which is where the outputs go, so the hydrogen and the oxygen in this case. And then you pick how many standard recipes of it you want to make. And again, for each process, a standard recipe is basically how much of each input and how much of each output you get as a result of that. So it's sort of the ratios between the inputs and the outputs. So and for water electrolysis in particular, you put in 9 units of water and you get out 8 units of oxygen and 1 unit of hydrogen by mass. So that's the standard recipe for water electrolysis. And but the one thing that hadn't been specified yet was the timings for processes. So basically, how long does it take for that process to run? And sort of that determines basically how difficult that process is to run. Like there's sort of the inputs, the amount of inputs that are required determine that partly. If they're really hard to get inputs, like if it requires a bunch of, say, tantalum or a bunch of gold or whatever, those are going to be processes that are going to be more expensive to run since the inputs are more expensive. But also a process that is slower to run will be more expensive because it takes more of your crew's time and more of the building's time to be able to run that process. So what I've now wrapped up on is the initial pass on all those timings. And the way that timings are defined in Influence is basically it's a linear model for them. What that means is that there are two terms that are relevant there. There's the slope, which basically says for however many standard recipes that you want to make of that product, how long will it take? What's the slope of that? Like how much longer does it take for every additional standard recipe that you want to make? So something that has a really high slope means that, say every standard recipe takes, 10 real life hours or whatever it might be. Then if you want to make 2, it'll take 20. If you want to make 3, it'll take 30, etc. That's the slope part of it. And obviously the higher that slope, the more expensive it is to make more of that product that you're making in that process. And the other part of that is the constant factor, which is basically how much time it takes for every time you take that action in general. So, for example, say you're again doing water electrolysis, and say you wanted to make 10 standard recipes. Let me just grab the actual numbers here so that it's more understandable for you guys. Okay, so for water electrolysis, we have a B factor, which is the constant factor for the process timing, and that's 2 Adalian hours. So every time you run a water electrolysis process, like take the action itself, there's this constant time of 2 hours, no matter how many standard recipes you're making, that applies. So if you're making 1 kilogram of oxygen, for example, like which is a very tiny amount, like you'd never do that. But if you were making 1 kilogram, it would still take you 2 whole Adalian hours just to set up the process to be able to do water electrolysis. And keep in mind that is the amount of time that your crew has to spend there. So that's a very relevant number for determining your logistical thinking about your crews, how long they're going to be sort of bound up by running a process. So that's the B value, and then for say you're doing 10 standard recipes of water electrolysis, the M value, which is the slope again, the number of hours, Adalian hours per standard recipe, is 0.0378, which is not a number that you need to remember. The game client it knows all these numbers and will just calculate them for you based on you sliding a slider back and forth of like how much you want to make basically. But that's the number, and so if you're making 10 of that, it would take 0.378 Adalian hours, and so the total process time to run that process would be 2 plus 0.378 or 2.378 Adalian hours to run that process. And an Adalian hour is 1/24th of a real life hour, so you can do the math to figure out the real life time that would take to run that. But basically, every single process has its own M and B value, the constant and the slope of how much time it takes to do that. And so when you guys are looking at the JSON file that I just released, or any of the websites that the community has put together to sort of pull that data in once they've managed to do that, you will be able to see basically how hard that process is. Basically, I mean, this is what the timings are: is like how long it takes, how hard it is to do that process. So that's numbers that we now have for every single process. And the other thing is, I don't think most of the recipes themselves, the standard recipes, had actually been put together when I released JSON. I think it was literally just the like which products come from which processes and go into which processes, like the inputs and outputs. But now we have all the recipe numbers as well that tell you how much of each input and output you need for a standard recipe of each process. So together, the timings and the standard recipes really tell you all you need to know about what is required to run a process and how long it will take. And so I'm really excited to have got those numbers to a state where you guys can actually take a look at them. I will say, as I mentioned when I released them last night, is that these are still work in progress numbers. The balancing stage is actually what I'm going into right now. I'm finally getting to a point where I can. When I was creating the numbers, I was doing my very best to sort of guesstimate where they should be to make the processes as hard as they should be or as easy as they should be, and to make the products sort of be as cheap or as expensive as I was intending them to be. But those are just guesstimates. I'm sure I've made some egregious errors here and there about things that are way too hard or way too easy that I didn't intend to be such. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm actually going through and creating some tools for myself to help me assess the actual expense of each product according to these production chains, and that will inform me a lot about whether I need to adjust the timings or even in some cases the recipes. Although the recipes are a lot more sort of realistically created, the timings are a bit more sort of hand wavy. Some of them are very accurately modeled, but then I've sort of gone in and filled in between them with sort of more hand wavy guesstimated values for the process timings. So those are the ones that I'll probably change when I'm rebalancing is those process timings. But the numbers you have in front of you are a great starting point, hopefully. So yeah, that'll be coming up next, and the plan is to have a final release of this JSON file, and the SDK format of that as well, which is a different format that some of you may have may have seen in the past few weeks. Those will be released. A final version of that will be released sometime around when we're going into pre-release. So that will be numbers that have been balanced, have gone through that process of making sure that they're sort of where I want them to be, and ultimately should be good for the game. So that's just the overview of what I've released, but I would love to be able to take any questions that you guys might have. I know that Chabot isn't here, but he had an interesting one, which I can probably just take first on his behalf. Hopefully he can listen to this later. But basically he was asking, what about power? How does electrical power usage feed into these processes and the timings specifically? The answer to that is that for the factory, shipyard, and bioreactor buildings, it doesn't really. Those are modeled sort of differently. They are sort of created based on estimates of how long, in the case of the shipyard and the factory, how long it would take to create certain numbers of output products, since they only ever have a single product that comes out as the output for those buildings. Those are sort of estimated based on like how long does it take to make a robotic arm, or how long does it take to make this or that. The bioreactor is basically estimated based on grow times for what you're growing in there. So things like potatoes, things like soybeans, things like algae. Those are actually pretty accurate numbers for how long it takes to grow a crop of those various things. So you'll see those numbers when you encounter them in the bioreactor. And keep in mind that the bioreactor is actually batched. So unlike the other buildings, if you make a little bit of something in the bioreactor, you actually have to take the full amount of time to like grow a potato. Even if you're growing one potato plant, it's going to take you 3 months to grow that potato plant of in-game time. So just keep that in mind for the bioreactor. For the refinery, however, this is the chemistry building where sort of different basic products are being combined, refined, sort of processed in various chemical ways. There are a lot of processes that are power limited. That's what Chabot was asking about, is processes that the speed of the reaction is dictated by how much energy and how much electricity basically you have available to you to make that reaction proceed. And some reactions are power limited, which means you need that power, and some aren't. Some actually produce power themselves, like they produce heat energy, like they're exothermic. And so those, you can basically just throw together the reactants and they'll just do their thing on their own. You don't really need much power to run those at all. So there's two kind of camps there, the power limited ones and not power limited ones. And in the game mechanics, those aren't really differentiated at all, at least for exploitation. They have the same M and D values, sort of types of values that all the other processes do. But what I've done is for the power limited ones, I've assumed a certain amount of power is available to the refinery. In this case, I think it's 10 megawatts is the amount of power. And then I've gone in and researched, or in some cases sort of hand wavy made up, but based on the research, made up kilowatt hours per kilogram numbers for the amount of power that it takes to run that process. And then that is fed in through the number of megawatts that the building is assumed to have from the photovoltaic solar panels that all the buildings have. And then that dictates what the end value is for that building. For the not power limited ones, those are also sort of estimated based on processing rates. A lot of cases, it's like how long does it take you to grind up the rock if you're going to do a leach process on it, or how long does it take you to like pipe this much hydrogen from here to there? So there are real world comparable numbers out there that I've been sort of gathering that inform these pieces of information. So they're based in reality, but also sort of balanced, hand tuned to the difficulty levels I think they should be at for various processes in the game. So that's how power feeds into our current understanding of process timings. Later on in discovery, we might make that more explicit. We might, make an actual in-game mechanical differentiation between power limited and not power limited processes. But for now, it's just sort of folded into the calculations. Let's see. So Illyrium, you've got a question. From the tools you mentioned that you're using, would any of them be of use to the community devs? I think so. Like once I've completed the balancing, which I'm starting in on right now, I think I will have some pretty interesting tools that you guys will want to get your hands on, especially like the sort of trace modeling tools. So yeah, I'll say that there's nothing that you guys are probably super interested in at this exact moment, but there probably will be soon, and those will be released one way or another into your guys' hands when I get a chance to do that. Yeah, if anybody else has questions, feel free to raise your hand and pop on stage, or I can take them in chat, and I'll just go until there's a long enough awkward silence that we'll call it good. So. I see. We've got questions from Lyrium, Commissar coming in, and Athrex. Commissar is asking when cookies. Well, if you look into the production chains right now, you will see that sadly there are not cookies in those chains. You will see that there is a food production chain, a food process. So that's a pretty interesting one. It takes some of the outputs of the bioreactor and assembles them into food in the factory. So you can imagine that food is cookies, but it's probably more like various MRE type freeze-dried meal packets. In discovery, I think you can expect that cooking will actually take on quite a bit of a larger role. There's, obviously we have the ROD jobs that some of which are actually various cooking related jobs, which is pretty interesting. I think especially in discovery, you can expect the bioreactor to take on a much more important role in sort of making various foods, various ingredients, various drugs potentially. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that the bioreactor will be producing, and I think cooking will probably take on a greater role, and I think cookies would certainly be something that would be appropriate for for that release of new features. So Nathrax is asking spectral abundances, how close are we to that? So that really just depends on the balancing that I'm doing right now, that I'm starting in on right now. Pretty much the goal there is to ensure that none of the spectral types are like especially weak or incapable compared to the other ones. It's a really interesting question, like what that actually means, because on some level, like markets will take things that are less available and make them more expensive in order to balance things out on their own. And so, like any work I do to balance things is sort of not acting in opposition to, but is almost redundant with what the markets will end up doing. But the price points that things land at will be different based on the numbers that I'm balancing right now. And so our goal is to make things be sort of priced roughly where we're expecting them, relatively speaking, to each other. And the spectral abundances will be part of that, just to ensure that asteroids have outputs that are comparable to each other in terms of monetary sort of resource creation. So that'll be at the end of the balancing, is to answer your question. Let's see. HD, did you want to speak or no? Yes, the meals do kind of look like cookies, I suppose. You could pretend that. Let's see. Do you have any specific questions, Lyrium, about parsing the JSON? I can, be happy to take those at any time. Let's see. Okay, Nathrex is asking about taenite being the only source of copper, and I think that's accurate. Okay, you'd think that I would know absolutely everything about these production chains at this point, but it's been months and months since I've looked at some of these things, and so I have to go back to the sheet myself and remind myself. Let's see. Yeah, so it's just Tainite that copper comes from. That's correct. And copper is a fairly important product in the game. It feeds into, obviously copper wire, which has roles in motors and avionics and all sorts of things. So copper is an important one, but it is kind of a byproduct of tainite. Obviously, the iron is the primary component of tainite. So, but you could also get some copper and some nickel out of that as well. HG Games is asking, what is the difference between M medallion hours per SR and B medallion hours per action? And these are two sort of field names in the JSON file that I released for processes. The M medallion hours per SR, that's the slope of those process timings. So the number of medallion hours that you will have to take to produce a single standard recipe of that process. It's called M because M is the slope in a slope-intercept form linear equation. And B, medallion hours per action, is just the constant factor on how long it takes every time you run that action, regardless of how much you're making. And it's called B because B is the constant factor in the linear approximation. Illyrium is asking, do the new processes allow for some sort of infinite loop, like outputs of process X feeding into the inputs of process Y? Yes, the answer is absolutely. There are cycles in the graph, in graph speak. They're basically the places you'll find that are typically kind of low down in the production chains, where things like, to take a really basic example, water electrolysis, you can split water into hydrogen and oxygen. You can go right back around again and use hydrogen combustion and burn the hydrogen with oxygen, and you get water back again. That's just sort of how basic chemistry works. Is like, you take a long time and a bunch of energy to split the water apart, and then you, in a flash, in a bright flash of energy, you can burn them back together again, and you get water again. So, there's a number of those kinds of cycles, and things like, methane can be split, things like, ammonia can be split and recombined. There's a bunch of sort of basic chemicals like that are cyclable. And I think that'll be a really interesting mechanic in the game where, if you have an asteroid that has more of one or the other, it's not the end of the world if you can't get economically mine one of those particular raw materials, because you can usually actually produce it again with some chemistry and some time with a refinery. The Oh, and there's also some of those that are occurring higher up, where you'll see some of the more advanced processes, refinery processes, having multiple outputs, some of which will be kind of basic outputs, oftentimes like carbon dioxide or oxygen or hydrogen. You'll see those kinds of outputs very frequently as side products from some of these more advanced reactions. Usually you'll not choose those as the primary output, so you won't be getting a ton of it back, but you get enough of it back that it might be economically worth it to save that and to use it in other processes where you might need it. And those, of course, constitute cycles as well, where you go through this whole long process of refining something, and all along the way you're getting some of these secondary outputs, which actually might be useful to go back into the initial stages of that reaction or that chain. So I think you guys will really enjoy digging into that and figuring out like where economies and recycling can be realized, where you can sort of take those things and reuse them in other parts of your flows. But it makes analyzing the graphs a little bit harder because, yes, there are cycles in those graphs, which means that you can't just sort of naively follow, every process back to its parent and then follow out into its parent, and then eventually you just get to mining. Like, that doesn't work, because sometimes you'll hit something that'll take you back around again, and your code has to do that. It has to understand that and realize that it needs to stop if it gets stuck in one of those loops and not just keep looping forever. HD Games is saying, open the whole JSON file in a text editor and writing everything into Excel file. Yeah, I mean, it's designed for programmatic parsing. It's, you can do it by hand if you really want to, but it's designed to be read with a script and easily worked with that way. Mathrex is asking, how efficient is it to create hydrogen from ammonia versus from distilled water? Well, you can look at that yourself and see. Let's see, let me just put numbers. So the ammonia catalytic cracking is one approach there. So ammonia catalytic cracking basically is where you take ammonia and you split it into the constituent hydrogen and nitrogen that's in that. I mean, ammonia is NH3, so hydrogen is H2, and ammonia is, or nitrogen is N2. So that takes 0.0271 hours per standard recipe, and then 22 for the B per action value. So that's, not too bad. If you compare that with getting hydrogen from the distilled water, so electrolysis, it's 0.0378 per standard recipe, but the standard recipe is actually quite a bit smaller in that case. So I think the ammonia is probably gonna win in that case. You'd have to run the numbers to sort of get a per kilogram price or time cost on that, and that's part of what I'm going to be doing shortly with balancing. But you could do that too if you wanted to figure out which one's more efficient. And any answer about like what's the best way to do something is always going to be dependent on the situation. So if you have a lot of something, even if it's slower to process that into the thing you want, then that's probably going to be what you're wanting to do rather than doing the thing that's slightly faster, but you have almost none of the inputs. It's always context dependent on like what you have and like have available for running your processes. Yeah, Illyrium, it sounds like you're getting stuck in some loops. So the way to deal with loops, Illyrium, is to put a flag on every single product in the game or in the production chains, and when you're going through it and sort of exploring it with your code, make sure that you set that flag to true if you've ever looked at it, and then next time you're coming around, and if you're in a cycle, you need to look, and every time you see a true flag, you need to stop because that means you've already been there. That'll stop you from getting stuck in infinite loops. Let's see. So Mathrex is asking that cargo limits have been changed. How much hydrogen can a light transport carry? The actual volume limits of the ships we've adjusted upwards. They used to be quite low because for the cargo hold for ships. We've adjusted them upwards. The exact numbers are not actually finalized yet. But I think the answer there is that it's probably not going to be holding the same amount of hydrogen as the cargo tanks, but maybe around half of that. I think is going to be the volume limit there. So you might expect something like 1,000 tons of hydrogen in a light transport cargo hold, in addition to the 2,000 tons of propellant that's in the propellant tanks. That's probably the rough answer there. Professor Tabor is asking, like, will it be more cost effective to bring hard resources that can be used to produce hydrogen than to ship the hydrogen itself? Yeah, I mean, if you're going to somewhere that has native hydrogen, like an I-type or even a C-type with water on it, potentially, it might be more cost effective to ship the materials you need to produce that hydrogen versus shipping the hydrogen itself. I mean, that's called in situ resource utilization in the real world in space exploration. And it basically says use what you can find locally rather than bringing it with you, if at all possible. Bring the tools to make it rather than bringing the stuff itself. And I think that's absolutely going to apply for a lot of things in influence. Where if you know that somewhere where you're going has the raw materials to make something, you're going to bring the tools to make it there rather than bring all that stuff yourself. Take care, Counselor. Yep. Let's see. Yeah, I mean the liquid hydrogen tanks. It's not efficient. Like we actually don't store it compressed because that's not efficient. We store it liquefied. It travels as a liquid rather than as a solid, just because that's the optimal way to compress it. Liquefied. Now, if anybody else has questions, I'll just be here to take them. But I'm also not gonna stick around for too long if folks got through all the questions. So. Hey, yep.
Hey, Proto, can you hear me? So yeah, I'm getting ready to go leave for an event, but I wasn't sure if you already answered this, but maybe a little bit of information, if this hasn't already been addressed, on what kind of balancing might be expected once pre-release, starts, and how what you're actually going to be tweaking
so right now what I'm
when it
entering
comes to
into is
balancing.
a sort of balancing phase where I'm going to be trying to model the relative prices of various products based on the numbers that the production chains have currently. So that'll just be based on some various simplified assumptions about how the economy will work and how materials will flow between different processes in the game in that economy. And that'll all just produce sort of these rough guesses about prices of things that do have more information in them than my literal in my head rough guesses that I've put into the production chains thus far. And the output of that will be a quote unquote balanced set of production chains that will be feeding into our pre-release testnet. So once we get to that stage, at that point I will be watching the actual pre-release economy where you guys are all playing the game on testnet and actually trading things. And various prices will actually be found on the marketplaces for testnet things, for the various products in the testnet. And I think that will be super informative too to sort of see how close my guesses were with the modeling of the economy and the modeling of the different prices of products. It may be that I find that I was wildly off, or maybe I was pretty close. But whatever I find there will inform further balancing that will take place between pre-release and the actual exploitation release. We want to get as much of that balancing done as possible before the mainnet game launches, because obviously it's less optimal to be going in and tweaking those numbers after the game is being played with real money and real assets. We would prefer to not do that as much as possible. So yeah, again, I'll be watching what happens on testnet and just sort of tweaking. And the numbers I'll be specifically tweaking are almost certainly going to mostly be the timings, not the recipes. There are a few cases where I have my eye on some of the recipes, especially the buildings. I'm going to see what happens to the balancing right now before the testnet, and that'll probably change the building somewhat. But I think testnet will also inform a lot of that. So that you can expect the building standard recipes to probably change, and also I think the hydrogen fluoride, I've got my eye on that one. That's the acid. It's actually when you're producing, I think it's aluminum from feldspar, which is the one source of aluminum we have in the game. There's no bauxite, which is really inconvenient. But basically, the real life chemistry is very expensive to produce aluminum from feldspar, and I've modeled that faithfully in the processes. And my expectation is that that will make aluminum be too expensive, and so I'm planning to probably change that recipe somewhat. So you can expect that to change from from the version you've seen in the thing I released yesterday. Let's see, Nathrax is asking, will asteroids be balanced through spectral abundances to reflect products that are critical but do not go directly into ship production, like food and core samplers? Yes, I mean, the entire economy will be taken into account with balancing spectral abundances. Like, everything will have a value, I mean, core samplers and food go into everything. Like there's a need for core samplers for every time you mine something. Like there was a certain number of core samplers that had to go into that deposit that is being used to extract with. Every time you run any process, there's a certain amount of food that a crew would have to take to run that process. So those will be modeled for sure and included in balancing. Illyrium is asking, this is probably the plan already, but on future changes in the production chains, it will be really helpful to preserve the IDs from older versions of the chains, because the community tools will likely use those IDs to save certain production chains plans with specific processes selected for a given planned product. Yes, definitely. My intent is for IDs to be pretty permanent. Obviously, as I've been developing the chains, IDs have been changing here and there, and you might see that between the previous JSON from last fall and the one that I just released yesterday. Those are super in development, so it was expected that a lot of those would change. But yeah, going forward, the goal will be to keep those IDs as consistent as possible, since they, obviously a lot of things like the community tools that you're talking about will be built up around them. HD actually noticed an interesting thing, which is that there are gaps in some of the IDs. You might see like, there's no process 160 or whatever it might be. The answer to why that is just that, as I've been developing, sometimes the process will be removed, sometimes I'll be adding processes, sometimes I needed to like leave myself some space for adding new processes. So you'll see some various gaps, and they don't mean anything. Take care, Storage Week. Threx is asking, what tools do we have available in-game to view production chains or know what to build with the materials we have? The answer is in-game. We've been sort of waffling back and forth, but there was this product view that we had been thinking about, where you basically would be able to click from the icon of a product wherever you saw it, and it would take you to the sort of 3D model of the product and an explorer of the various processes that either take that product as an input or give it out as an output. And you could sort of navigate through by clicking on those processes and navigate to other products. I think that we decided to put that slightly on hold for exploitation, but it will probably be coming out after that. Not 100% on that though. I actually forget whether we decided to go with that or not. But either way, you'll see that probably at or after exploitation. But it's a very basic way to navigate the chain. It doesn't really show you like entire trees of processes. It really just like sort of lets you poke around based on what product you're looking at and like what you can make with it or what it is made with. Basically we are saying that for any more advanced navigation of the production chains, you should go and check out some of these community tools that have been built by people like Illyrium or Taharius. They're just really interesting ways to look at the chains that we are not focusing on analyzing ourselves. I think largely that's something we would like the community to do, and so far they have been doing it really well. So I think that'll probably continue going forward. Professor Saber is asking, will there be any resource balancing based on how the markets get fed by the player base? What if no one owns a rock that has or is mining a critical base resource? Like if a base resource is scarcer than intended, what happens then? Mad dash around the system to corner the market. The answer is that we expect that during the very beginning phases of the belt expansion, like right after exploitation launch, that yes, there will be resources that nobody is making. Nobody has the buildings or the infrastructure to actually produce that resource, and that's why we're seeding everything. So we'll be seeding every single product in the production chains at large volume at the beginning of the game, and so that will intentionally be there to prevent people from cornering the market during those early phases when very few people have access to those resources. And we will stop seeding the markets once we are confident that there's sufficient industrial base present across the belt, across different players, that any product could be produced, in an emergency if somebody was trying to corner it, that people could just go and make their own mines or make their own production chain buildings and produce that product and avoid the market being cornered. Because that's how markets are supposed to work when they're like liquid, when they have enough, players active in them, is that, anytime something starts getting more expensive, you just have more people going and making that thing because it's, worth their time to do it. And then that brings the price back down into equilibrium again. And that's really what we'd like the economy to be in a state of, is just naturally balancing itself based on that. But during the very early phases, that's when cornering the market will be an issue, and that's when we'll be seeding things and potentially reseeding things if somebody tries to buy up all the seeded materials, for example. Nathrix is asking, are there any plans for a mini tutorial or daily missions for new players so they can get more familiar with production chains? I think we would love to do some sort of tutorial system in the future. That's one of the things that polished games have, is a nice tutorial system, especially for games as complicated as Influence. I think it would be great to have. It's also one of those things that we're prioritizing getting the game out there versus getting all the sort of hyper advanced polished things that we will eventually have. So I think that's something you can expect after exploitation. For now, we're trying to produce various tutorial videos or get community members or content creators to create those kinds of videos for us, and that'll sort of hopefully bridge the gap until we have better tutorial systems in place. As far as daily missions, I will punt on that, but I think you can keep your eyes open. I'll just say that much. Let's see, for Professor Saber, Seth. Hey, good. Yeah.
Yeah, hey, Proto, I just want to make a comment on the missions. Just so people are here who are curious, we are looking into kind of that missions, and pre-release we'll have our first set of missions that kind of go into more what I would call like three-dimensional tasks. We wouldn't be emitting sway, for example, to people and reward for them mining a single resource, because it's very, one-dimensional there. It's easily gameable. People can make 100 accounts. What's not gameable, though, is like moving through a production chain, using multiple buildings, things like that. And so we do want to encourage people to do those things, because that really does show progress in the game and utilizing, multiple resources. So that is something we're working on. In terms of a tutorial system, not at launch in game, but I am working alongside a creator that is going to be producing probably 10 tutorial videos, and a few of those would likely revolve around production buildings, production chains, and then kind of markets, so that people can kind of get attuned to that. So more information to come on that in the near future, and those would be coming out during full launch. And we'll be working on.
I'm really excited to see some of those videos. I think they'll be really valuable. Let's see. Yeah, Professor Saber is asking, he's foreseeing people getting stuck if asteroids don't have what you need on them. I think, I think the direction that goes is basically that there are tens of thousands of asteroids or at least 10,000 plus asteroids that have been purchased at this point, and so that very much represents all the different resources that are available in the belt. So hopefully, in sum, like all the resources will be very much mineable and available. I don't think people will get stuck in that way. The one way that you could very well get stuck is if you don't bring enough propellant to bring you back home again. Like if you go to an asteroid and use up all your propellant getting there, and then there's no way to get propellant when you get there. And so that's the case that the emergency transport, putting your ship basically into emergency mode, that's what that mechanic is for, is to sort of limp your way home by generating propellant very slowly in the ship itself. But in general, yeah, just bring enough propellant to get you home, get you back to your starting point again. That's a general rule. Or plan to make it somewhere where you're positive that you can make it, or supply on our market. I mean, overall, just getting like the economy getting stuck is something that we are worried about in the beginning of, right after launch, right after exploitation launch. And again, that's what seeding is for, is to allow us to sort of infuse the market with materials that are needed to keep things going and to not get stuck. But we'll only do that until we're confident that the game and the Italian economy can handle those kinds of things itself, which we expect to happen pretty quickly. Okay, take care either way. If anybody else has questions, now's the time to pop them in. Don't need to go for a full hour if folks have got their questions more or less answered for the time being. I will just say that I'm really excited to sort of start to see these production chains being fleshed out like this. It's, the goal there is for them to be really rich and interesting, and for you guys to have plenty of space to explore them, and plenty of niches to sort of identify and take on if you want to sort of work, as a production chain producer of materials in the game. And so I really hope that there are a bunch of little niches like that you guys can find and identify and sort of start to work within. One thing I would love to do actually before too long is do some sort of specific little infographics about parts of the production chains that I think might be of interest. I know that they're pretty big with all these like 250 processes and products. I think identifying like the uranium refinement flow, or the tantalum refinement flow, or the tungsten refinement, like there's just a bunch of sort of really interesting little subsets of the production chains that I think would bear sort of being called out maybe in little infographics. That's something that I sort of have on my mind to try to put together something like that at some point. But you'll see, and potentially community tools might also just do that. I expect, for example, the Illyrium or the Darius production chain viewers to sort of start getting into that kind of stuff as well. Yeah, any last questions before we wrap up here? I certainly got my work cut out for me with balancing, so I will probably want to get back to that pretty soon. Okay, well, I think, okay, I see Illyrium typing. One moment. That's okay. Oh, just saying thanks. All right, cool. Sounds like we're wrapping up here. I can, I'll be around in Discord, so I will be happy to take any further questions in Discord at any time. So just ping me. But all right, thanks for coming, everybody. Take care.